I know we're going through this awful fast. Um, World War II. I wish we could spend weeks on it because there's so many cool things to talk about. Like if you get a chance, go on Wikipedia and look up the Enigma machine and how we had to break the code of the Enigma machine um, to defeat the Germans in the war. And once we did defeat that code or break that code, we had to keep it a secret so that the Germans didn't get a new machine for their codes. Um, we could talk all about several battles. We just don't have time. And today we're just going to talk about how the war ended. The fall of Rome in June of 1944 was the beginning of the end of the war. The Soviets were gaining territory and moving toward Europe rapidly. And then we made the most massive um, landing in the history of war um, at Normandy Beach on June 6th of 1944. It was the largest amphibious assault in history, and we had troops flown in from France to the tune of 176,000 men, 4,000 ships, and 11,000 airplanes to land on that beach. If you've ever heard of a movie called Saving Private Ryan, their depiction of the invasion at Normandy is the first, 15 minutes of the movie or 20 minutes of the movie is terrifying to behold. You basically came in on a flat boat full of soldiers, jumped out into the water, ran onto the beach, and got your head blown off by German machine gunners up on the cliffs above you. And yes, we had enough men that we could finally eventually overwhelm the German positions, but it was just brutal, brutal, deadly warfare. Within a few weeks after the D-Day invasion, 1 million men were fighting in France. Because France was closed off by the Germans and, because they were controlling the country, within a few weeks we had 1 million men in France after Normandy. By August 24th, we had liberated France. So from June 6th to August 24th is all that longer it took us to liberate France. We had some amazing fighter pilots. They were the first to shoot down German jets. They were called the Red Tails, and they were black American fighter pilots. They were an all-black fighter pilot corps. Patton had made his way from Italy into Europe, but they hadn't allowed Patton to move into Germany, which was a big mistake, because Russia moved in instead. The Germans' final offensive, and Russia moving into Germany is a bad thing because Russia then takes foothold in almost all of Eastern Europe, which set up a massive communist state for a long time, until the 1990s, I guess. The final massive German offensive was the Battle of the Bulge. It lasted from December 1944 through January of 1945. The German offensive in the West in France was eventually defeated by Patton. I can't really go into detail today, but the Germans again ran out of gas and were defeated there in their last massive offensive, and Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. Or did he? There's rumors that Hitler just pulled his teeth out and put him on another dead guy for dental records and made his way to Argentina or somewhere where he lived out his life alone. Of course, his wife, Ava Braun, was killed in that whole suicide thing. Germany surrendered on May 7th of 1945, and we call May 8th VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day. And then we went about rounding up German war criminals and putting them on trial at Nuremberg. But the war wasn't over. We are still fighting. That whole island hopping thing in the Pacific was a good way to fight the war, but at the same time, it wasn't making enough progress, and the Japanese were not going to quit fighting until they were down to one man, and we shot him. We fought in Iwo Jima in February of 1945, and you see that famous monument of the men raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. We fought against 5,000 Japanese kamikaze pilots. They would load their plane with active explosives and fly their plane into the sides of U.S. ships. It wasn't very successful, these, what they're called kamikazes, for the Japanese, but hundreds of American lives were lost. The war was stretching out, and America had a weapon that they thought could be used to end the war. All through the war, with the help of German scientists that had run from Germany, at the urging of Albert Einstein, to the government, we had begun to develop something called atomic energy, which is tearing apart. And when you tear apart an atom and split it into smaller pieces, it puts off a great deal of energy. You can ask Mrs. House about how atomic or nuclear reactions work. But we had worked hard to develop material that was fissionable, that we could split apart in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and other places. The first nuclear reaction was in Chicago, under the University of Chicago. And then we built a massive thing at Los Alamos, New Mexico, and developed the nuclear bombs, atomic bombs, and then tested them for quite a long time right there in the deserts outside of Las Vegas. Roosevelt had died of a stroke at the beginning of his fourth term as president, the only president to be elected more than twice, on April 12th of 1945, and the Vice President Truman took over. He wanted to force an end of the war, an immediate and unconditional surrender to prevent the loss of millions of more American and Japanese lives. Japan refused to surrender. So Truman made the difficult decision to drop the largest bombs that have ever been dropped anywhere. I'm not talking about tested out in the Nevada desert. I'm talking about dropping them on population centers with hundreds of thousands of people. So they worked hard at this project in Los Alamos. It was called the Manhattan Project. It was the largest science project of its day. And the crazy part is the Russians had spies in it the entire time, forcing our lead scientists to give them information. And almost as soon as the war was over, they had their own atomic bombs. But these great scientists, Enrico Fermi, Teller, Robert Oppenheimer, built that bomb, and we dropped 2 of them. The first bomb was dropped on August 6th of 1945 on the city of Hiroshima, Japan, and it was the equivalent to 13,000 tons. 13,000 tons, that's 2,000 pounds times 13,000 of regular TNT. All at once. 92,000 Japanese people were dead or missing, and the city of Hiroshima was totally destroyed. And what happened after that? Germany still refused to surrender. 3 days later, we dropped a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, which forced the surrender, which happened on September 2nd, 1945. The Japanese surrendered on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and the war ended with the loss of life of 400,000 Americans and 60 million dead worldwide. Not even to mention the millions upon millions of wounded. After the war, the United States had to occupy Japan. And during that occupation, we began missionary work with Jacob DeShazer, who had actually been a POW and tortured by the Japanese, became a missionary to Japan. Near the end of the war, we had a conference, or maybe it was right after the war, I can't remember, in Yalta, which is a small town. I'm going to sneeze. I had a conference in Yalta. Oh, thank you. Where the Brits were worried about empire building, and Russia began to talk about bringing socialism to Africa and Asia, which actually happened in a large part, and where FDR, who was still alive, so I guess this happened before the end of the war, basically conceded everything that Stalin asked for. He saw Stalin as a peace-loving democratic socialist, and he wasn't. He was a maniacal, communist who had no thought for the value of human life. Roosevelt was very sick at the time. He'd probably already had a stroke, and he was bound to die within a few months. Roosevelt was taken advantage of by Stalin. One of Roosevelt's main advisors was Alger Hiss, a secret communist. By this time, Stalin had killed in his own nation dissenters and people that he thought were out to get him 10 million in the 1920s and the 30s. 10 million. That's almost more than the Holocaust. In the 1940s, they rounded up Jews, and the secret police called the NKVD in Russia killed off any Jews that they could get their hands on. So it wasn't the bad times weren't over for the Jewish people. Great Britain was so tired of the war that they basically left the U.S. to fight communism and they pretty much voted Churchill out of office and replaced him with a semi-socialist also. So this is what the U.S. ended up giving up at the end of the war to the Russians. Much of Poland, Manchuria, China, which didn't belong to the Russians, Mongolia, which didn't belong to the Russians. And they promised that within 2 years of the Nazi defeat, we would withdraw from the war. So we just let them do whatever they wanted to. Of course, we couldn't really afford to fight another war against Russia immediately following the war anyhow. But still, what the heck was going on?